Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss the blind spots of declinism. Tim.
If your society is in decline, as many people on the right will say, and as well as the left to some extent, then you may as well. One thing is you may as well enjoy the present, for tomorrow will be worse. To paraphrase Zizek once in the debate with a liberal, you should sit back, drink lemonade, and when that gets boring, watch pornography, and when that gets boring, go down and shoot yourselves. Or maybe play some music on the Titanic, a la Leonardo DiCaprio. A number of our mutual intellectual friends and former guests largely believe, and the question is correctly, if this is correct, that certain places are in decline, whether relative or absolute terms. I think that might be correct, but on a psychological level, it poses problems. Reason Magazine's Nick Gillepsie recently interviewed Bob Murphy, he's a libertarian in our circles, on whether American libertarians were unduly pessimistic. Bob Murphy's answer to the question of why do we get out of bed? We done an episode on that. And Nick Gillepsie of Reason Magazine didn't exactly ask that, but he asked, how do you live if you are that pessimistic? Murphy was bringing on the national debt. He was bringing on the fact that that the service of the debt is only going to increase. Then he's also bringing up the fact that the mass surveillance state that a la Edward Snowden, the fact that the U.S. empire in some ways is cornered in various areas, and so forth. And then this doesn't seem. But Nick Gillepsie was like, oh, everything's great. We have highest speed internet. Amazon one day shipping and so forth. And Murphy's answers, of course, was that he is a Christian. And for Murphy, I don't think you can say that somehow Bob Murphy is just isn't being genuine regarding that. And let's think about the sources of pessimism that various people talk about here. If your number one issue is demographics of, so to speak, native-born persons, to use the Hoppian doublespeak here, in places like the UK, America, Japan, South Korea, or Germany, or for that matter, fertility rates and reproduction rates, which are just directly related to. These things were much better when someone like Richard Nixon or Sidney Powell was alive. Now, Sidney Powell, like Margaret Thatcher talks about that. Is he right? Sidney Powell's famous for the blood in the streets, which you actually, when we did our famous speeches episode, you brought that up once, and I looked into him, and he apparently said he was only glad when his grandchildren were safely out of the UK. But unlike the 80s or 70s, fertility rates are way below replacements, and especially of the middle class types, upper and so forth in United States, Japan, England, Germany, and so forth. And I like to bring up this fact in places like Japan, adult diaper sales outweigh child diaper sales. Will United States, like New England, Old England, Germany, will they trend to that direction? Is that our future? Maybe it won't go Singapore or South Korea low, but who knows? It's a good question. So that's one of the first sources of pessimism here. And this has a lot. This is like maybe not the big enchilada, but it's an enchilada, to use terms. So I'll instead of going through all the issues of pessimism, I'm going to go issue by issue with him, and ask you, do you think the pessimistic take is right about this? And if so, what are we supposed to do if it's that pessimistic here? So then, first of all, are libertarians and other people, because you could just say the left's very pessimistic about the future. And that's what some said Nick Gillepsie was trying to really lean into about with climate change and other things, which, of course, Murphy and you and I don't believe. But that's first thing. So then, what do you make of this?
I think you got to distinguish a couple of things. I think you've got to distinguish firstly on an individual, on sort of your own social circle level, and then society as a whole. And then you need to discuss whether you're thinking of decline in the short term, the long term, or the medium term. So it seems to me to be perfectly possible to be pessimistic about society as a whole and say that even that's going down, even in the long run and the short and the medium run, but still be relatively optimistic about your own personal life, because it doesn't follow from the proposition that society is in general declining that you will decline as well. So you could well have a very good niche carved out for yourself, have decent income, 4 wife, kids, whatever, and so you could do pretty well. And so on that basis, then you could be pretty optimistic. Now, and so that would explain why no one gets out of bed, because this kind of higher level stuff is things that do impact you, but they impact you in a sense somewhat more indirectly. Also, even if you did hold that society in the short run is declining and in the medium term is in decline in general, as long as you were to hold that you think that society is will improve in the long run, then that would still give you reason to act, because maybe what you're doing is you're laying the foundations of something whilst we hit total decline, whatever that would mean in this context, and then this would help get society to raise up from the ashes. So a good example of that might be the Long Now project, I think, which is trying to get all the world's information on microfilm on the basis that it's actually technologically very simple to read. You don't want to put it in computer format because in the future people might not be able to read the files, whereas something that's physical and optical you can. And so then even if all the world's knowledge was destroyed, you'd then be able to access it and get back a lot quicker than you could have done, say, after the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, or something on those lines. And so in that sense, you do still, as I say, do have a reason to act. So maybe, society goes in decline, but then people find our podcast and are enlightened. And then, then sort of the green shoots rise up and society grows again. So that would be my general perspective. And I think those are coherent positions to hold. Whether or not society is in fact in decline isn't the question. And I would agree, although I would say in general that I don't like talking about initially whether society as a whole or anything as a whole is in decline. It's much better to focus on individual areas where it's much easier to say whether things are improving or not improving and in what respect. And then once you've done that, then be able to make an overall judgment as to whether there is decline or there's not decline. I think that's probably methodologically the best way of going, but we're going to hit the individual areas now, I think.
As far as the individual area I first mentioned, fertility and demographics, if you're like a Reason Magazine person, CNN, you'd actually welcome Reason with CNN. You'd actually welcome the recent changes. And actually, Nick Gillepsie, at least, unlike some people, is just honest about it. He'll say having fewer children. He's not quite NPR or like anti-natal, but like he had an interview with I think it's Dave Smith, and he was just saying, well, is having 25, having all these women, constantly pregnant a good thing? Actually, indeed. He's just arguing it's actually a good thing. So like some of the things that Murphy complains about are things that people like Nick Gillepsie would think are actually good things. But on the other hand, something like the national debt, this is an area of more so agreement. Every day, I would say the national debt, just because virtue of interest, gets worse. And I don't see anything changing that, other than like if eventually we have some sort of like hyperinflation or some sort of, this gets into like opaque discussions amongst like libertarians on this question here, and like Peter Schiff, this eternal decline narrative here, like are the MMTers right, and weird questions like that. But like if you look like if instead of thinking about the economy as numbers, let's just look around England and the United States, and to a lesser extent Germany or like South Korea. But like the United States, for example, and this was pointed out, I was following a theorist about like comparing the strengths of the Russians versus the Americans. People say the Russians are just a gas station with nukes, and stuff like that. But you could also argue that the United States is just a farmland with nukes too. United States may as well be that too. There's Moldbug likes to talk about how New Jersey used to produce everything in the world, warehouse of the world. What does New Jersey and New York? New York has a huge GDP compared to bigger than most countries, but it's a lot of it's entertainment, finance, things which don't exactly produce anything. If you had a global apocalypse, it's not exactly New York's expertise would be very useful, or Washington, or Brussels, or London. Maybe in the 1900s they would when they produced ships, but other than aircraft carriers, the United States doesn't produce any warships, major warships here. So you could argue that the economy is way worse than it was 40 years ago or 50 years ago in the United States and England. And you could also argue that demographic and family policy in empirical terms is way worse. So on those two issues within, and if indeed the economy is worse, then if indeed fertility is low, then it also means that pensions will fall apart and so forth. I mean, I think about this. Why do you get out of bed? If indeed Social Security is not going to exist when I'm just paying boomers to live in Phoenix, Arizona, or Kamala Harris to, give it extra benefits to Haitian migrants and so forth. Whether that is fake news or not is a good question. But even if it's half right, why spend? Because 10% of your income goes to Social Security in the United States or something like that. Why go to work? I mean, if it's not going to be there when I'm there. So that's my question here on the individual issues I just mentioned. Two of the big ones here. Would you say the declinists are right? And if they are right, what do we do about it?
Well, on the social aspect, yes, that's clearly in birth rate and stuff clearly in decline. You are right. Feminists, etc., would say, "Oh, well, birth rate's being low is a good thing." Although even then, though, I mean, that's really a facile reading. I mean, what you might want, well, it depends. I mean, there's various different things you can do. You'd think that they would at least want 2.2 or 2.1, depending on number of women who don't have children or who die before they can, because then you're going to have some sort of stable position with welfare states, etc. And you could, in principle, even buttress this with daycare and stuff. So there might be ways in which you could sort of have a similar system, but get the birth rate higher. Now, that said, it's probably going to be difficult to do that without changing the social situation, which they don't want to. But I mean, you'd think they'd at least try to do that rather than just go, "Oh yeah, one's fine." Unless, of course, they just take the view that, well, we just take the surplus population from foreign countries, which you could hold, and then you've got the immigration issue. As an aside with the whole Haitian thing, one of the things I read about that was there was some large corporation there who wanted lots of workers and basically thought that the locals were too expensive. And so that's apparently one of the motivations for letting all the Haitians in, lots of cheap foreign labor. But leaving that aside, it does seem to me clearly that demographics are in decline. How to change that isn't straightforward, because I think, well, actually, that leads into the economy, actually, and I'll return to it. Is the economy worse? I would say the economy is worse insofar as the mix of goods and services that are produced in the US and the UK in particular are wrong relative to genuine consumer preferences. And in the absence of the dollar's reserve status, the US military and central banks kind of messing around with stuff, you would have far fewer of these resources devoted in those. So, for instance, the UK is a good example. We've got so much of the value of the economy is produced in London in the financial sector, which is just basically fake money. And London hoovers up. I think I think of any major economy, England's is the most centralized insofar as their capital or their major city produces a greater share of GDP than any other of those cities. So, like Paris is nowhere near as high as London is as a proportion of France's GDP. Munich maybe. Germany has quite a lot of regional ones like Dortmund and things. So you have the wrong mix of stuff. Manufacturing is too difficult, but again, that's monetary, but also environmental, with the bans on fossil fuels and stuff to make it increasingly difficult to mine and things like that. So there's lots of things to pass out. So you've got the banking system, which makes the financialization much more valuable for people who are in the finance sector. So rather than the finance sector being a sector which helps the real sector do stuff, it becomes a sector in and of itself in isolation, which is weird at best. You then have all the regulations, ostensibly environmental reasons, which make it more difficult to produce energy and thereby, by extension, produce actual goods and services in your country. So that very much is a problem. But that said, we still do have a lot of technological development, and even if we don't produce things here, a lot of things are designed in, say, the US and the UK, and that is good. So there certainly are good aspects to the economy, and I would say in general, the digitization, the internet stuff is a good thing. But you are right with the national debt. I suspect that what they're trying to do with the national debt is to try to grow the economy more than the national debt grows, so that as a proportion of GDP it goes down, so that it can somehow maintain the payments with higher future tax revenues. But the demographics are a problem for that. So they're a short-term fix with immigration. But then again, that just kicks a can further down the road. So then the hope is you just might get mass technological advancement to increase productivity and therefore output, and thus to keep the same tax rates, get higher tax revenue. It's just very unlikely. So they could do it, and they could, in principle. I don't see why they couldn't do it. I just think it's very unlikely. And even if they did do it, you'd still have the recurring business cycle financialization stuff, which will ultimately cause a problem. When, I don't know, but will. But as Peter St. Onge said in his interview with Robert Murphy, yes, you will get the classic Austrian business cycle stuff, but if you were to deregulate in a genuine sense in other areas, whilst that'll be a problem, you have to reallocate, you get this boost elsewhere. So the recession might not be quite as bad as you might think it would, because it's not being taken place in isolation. Now, back on the financialization stuff and the social thing. One of the major barriers to family formation, at least in the UK, is that most couples will want to own a house before they have kids, if they're sort of lower middle class or above, and they're not someone who's going to be like, well, we'll just take welfare pay. The increase in the house prices house prices now, as the average house price in the UK as a multiple of average income is the highest it's been since, I think it's probably like the 1910s or something. It's absolutely huge. Just give me 1 second. I will find the numbers I'm looking for. So no, it's the highest it has been since the late 19th century. So it's now an average of about 9 times average income to buy an average house. Now, obviously, there'll be different regional differences, but that really prevents family formation. Also, as well, it makes men less desirable to women because they can't afford a decent house and provide decent financial resources, which causes delay in family formation and thereby birth rates in many cases. And again, and as well, I mean, when it comes to birth rates, though, I think one of the main things is cultural. the media and things say that, well, the way women become valuable is to become corporate drones, and so that's what they become, because they're very concerned of fitting in society and are very attentive to cues, social cues of what's the right thing and what's the wrong thing to do. So you need to break that. How you break that, difficult. I suppose abolition of intellectual property law might help, because you might get fans who make decent Marvel stuff, which isn't crazy feminist nonsense, amongst other things. But that's a long and detailed question. And as I say, intellectual property is a problem as well, because it, with things being more technologicalized and subject to patents and copyright and things, the distorting impact of IP becomes greater. So those have been my thoughts briefly on demography and the economy.
So the question here about was decline, and if it is, what are like the psychological effects of decline, if indeed decline is happening? Because as I pointed out, people like Matt Ridley, Nick Gillepsie, and some others, and actually even Bob Murphy, one corner, did admit that he was just basically, well, he is a Christian, and in that sense, he is a believer in happiness long for what everyone. Happiness is a dubious word, I understand, but happiness in a long run. But for that sense, not because not because he looks at the financial charts and thinks, wow, the United States is doing great, or the geopolitical situation, oh wow, the United States is doing great. So in that sense, that's how Bob Murphy would answer that question, and that's a genuine answer. I'm not like that's probably, if anything, that's probably the best answer. But let's think about the culture here, because that's another thing that people on the left, like someone like Herbert Marcuse, or some, of course, the right, or many of our friends we've had, or intellectual guests we've had, Rick Story, Todd Lewis, some others, Sean Gabb, we've had these on. I think it's quite clear that like mainstream culture, this is an area where I'm patently obvious in my opinion. Mainstream culture, as in like mass consumer culture, is in quote unquote decline. Both in quality and in like what their message they're doing. Yes, you can find some exceptions, but the exceptions are harder to find. So like let's think about films, for example, and popular music. It's quite clear that like you can, Christopher Nolan movies are great, but like, and maybe Tom Cruise movies, but anywhere else, if you think about mainstream movies, they're all trash, and it's just whether or not they're politically correct to it. I made the mistake of seeing this Kong versus Godzilla, and I'm not joking. The three main characters were a black guy, a woman scientist, and an indigenous child. I couldn't make this up if it was a parody. And again, it's not that it's bad just because they have those people as their characters. It's also bad because the story's dumb. Like, if you want to make a story about, like, suspicion of science, like the 1950s B movies about, like, atomic spiders attacking Los Angeles, like there's a way in which that sort of predicts, the Wuhan lab and Francis Collins and Fauci. There's like a weird way in which that movie does predict that. But like this movie, no, it doesn't have an intellectual message. Even if you just made all the character, even if you don't look at the character, the politically correct character information, it's just dumb. And you could, well, maybe in the 1950s and 40s, you could find movies like this. And like, I've watched actually a decent number of movies from the 40s and 50s, and like, they didn't have special effects. So these sort of smash movies wouldn't really exist here. So they had to sort of get by on characters and themes and things like that. So I think the quote unquote the people say the formal cultures in decline are right. I'd also would say that the media is also in decline, the mainstream media. Although in this regard, I would say, same with the culture, private creators seem to be way better. Like Glenn Greenwald's a great journalist. There's lots, you can find these people on Rumble, you can find these people on Substack and Twitter, and they're amazing. But like my local newspaper, like just runs trash written by the AP about January 6th, or, why aren't people taking the vaccines and things like that. This is my local newspaper. It's not really a local newspaper. It's like New York Times, whatever. So even in like the 70s and 80s, the BBC or NPR might interview a verboten person and not just attack them constantly with annoying, idiotic questions and so forth. Now, maybe that's just an illusion in the 70s, 80s. But in this regard, I think the declinists are right. My response to them would be like, well, first of all, don't go to mainstream movies. Either watch old movies or find obscure ones that are made today by private creators. But that'd be my response. Here's an area where I do think there is decline. I don't know if I would have thought that 10 years ago, but now I think it's obvious. But I think about this, and I think, was that always the case? Were people in the 50s thought that, well, because you find old interviews of elders in like 1930, and they thought everything changed. Now, did they think, like this idea of getting older and finding that the culture is trash isn't new? But is it? Are we in a cultural desert here? It's not just people on the right who says that. You can find random people on the left who also say, like, this is one reason I like listening to Chris Cutrone. Like, Chris Cutrone also thinks most of these Star Wars movies are trash. A lot of these sort of mainstream shows are trash. He's someone also I like who thinks that, and he's like a Marxist. He doesn't call himself a tanky, but he definitely in that direction. So I think, what would you make of the question on culture? Is it in decline? And what do we do about it if indeed is the case?
I think television and mainstream, film and mainstream news is very much seemingly in decline. You are exactly correct when it comes to long form programming and things, and being able to interview people without actually interrupting them. So I watched recently David Frost interview Oswald Mosley in 1967, and you can tell Frost does not like Mosley at all, but he allows him to speak, and there's a heckler who heckles, and Frost says, okay, yeah, say what you want, and then makes him be quiet and allows Mosley to respond to his comment. Today, you just get heckling and heckling and heckling, and so that you never actually be able to respond to anything. So mainstream news stuff very much does seem to be in decline. They don't tend to, a lot of the time, presenters, this is a journalist guy I know, said that a lot of presenters interview other journalists about their take on stuff rather than rather than cutting to a journalist actually asking somebody who knows things about things like a politician or whatever, what's actually happening. So you're always getting filter upon filter upon filter. Now, of course, there's always been agendas and stuff at play, Chomsky is clear on that, and that's obvious. But the mainstream news is definitely in decline. It's very much sort of 24-hour news. It's all about breaking news. It's all frivolous nonsense. That said, there always has been frivolous nonsense, but it does seem to have completely overtaken everything else. Although, interesting as an aside, you might think this is because now voting matters even less than it used to the extent that voting might have mattered, then there may have been a demand for actually being informed about things so you could vote and change things. Maybe to the extent that everybody now votes and therefore it loses its impact, then the demand for that kind of thing goes away. Film is difficult to say. I haven't really watched that many new films. My general view on film is that I don't like very many of them anyway. And there have been some very good films in recent times. I think what you have in film, though, is that television has now become a good competitor to it, where it otherwise historically couldn't have done. So back in the 80s and the 90s, film was way superior in general to the quality of television, because television didn't do long format stuff just because of the nature of it. People didn't have recording devices. You couldn't watch it when you wanted to. If you missed an episode and it was a continuous story, then you'll have absolutely no idea what's happening if you missed one episode and there was no way of catching up. So you get lots of standalone episodic stuff. So like traditional Star Trek, for instance, was like that. And then you get the rise of television. So there's some quite good long form television. Now, to be fair, a lot of that I don't like either. But early seasons of Game of Thrones, The Wire would be ones that brought up here. 2000s onwards are actually very good, at least in comparison with historical stuff. But yeah, it does seem to be, though, with cultures from, I think it's around 2012. Now, the theory goes here is that from 2012, moves were afoot from the Democrats to get rid of Occupy Wall Street. And so then the various powers that be decide to play the progressive, secular progressive moralist stuff in everything, race, sex, etc. And that's why you end up with media turning down this, oh, look at all these really IQ 175 black lesbian disabled people who can get us to space. Even though the undercurrent was there before, it becomes much more clear in like the last 10 years or so, 12 years. That has infected lots of stuff. So that does seem to be in decline. So it's a mixed bag. I think you have a decline of various, a comparative decline of various art forms have been supplanted by other things. So as you said, in media, you can follow independent commentators and things and get much more interesting commentary than you otherwise would have been able to. So again, I think in general, I think the impact of it is generally probably bad. But for those who care to look, there is better stuff out there than there was, say, 40 or 50 years ago.
I could include some other issues here, but I'm including the issues as an example, doing an empirical study on the issue, and then asking, is it in decline or is it not in decline? If it is in decline, what do we do about it? Because this goes back to the why do we get out of bed question episode we did. If you genuinely I think Nick Gillepsie actually has a good question there. Nick Gillepsie's reason can be very terrible on all sorts of things, and I'm well aware of that, and it bothers me. But I think the question there is a valid question in the sense that, if you believe the U.S. debt is $36 trillion, it's going to just keep adding, whatever a day and that's only going to multiply just based on the interest. It's just there is a sense in which, the Bob Murphy take about the empirical reality, the best thing is just not to think about it. There's kind of just, put your head in the sand, so to speak, and just not think about it. So, and then on the other issues we've mentioned, it doesn't seem like, if you're going to escape into the cultural fields, well, first of all, you could become an independent creator content, but even then, it could be that window has closed too. We'll see how much censorship the regime is able to pull off here. Brazil recently, banned Twitter or X, and then France arrested the CEO of Telegram. They also banned Rumble. So even on those windows, I think Murphy's claim about surveillance, maybe the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, even up to 2016, the creators were allowed, quote unquote, freedom to find out things that they weren't able to do before. If you try to look up things, it's harder to find things. Now, if you remember that you looked them up, there's a podcast I listened to called Conspiracy Pill, and he points out that it's like Google's search engine is a joke anymore for anything that's not anodyne. You have to almost use, and DuckDuckGo is trending that direction according to him anyway. You have to occasionally find out alternate search engines and stuff like that if you want to find, if you want to, or look at or you're gonna have to go a long fishing expedition in the 10th page, so forth, if you want to find things that aren't out there. So even there, you could say, well, the independent media and independent culture, so to speak. Even you want to say the mainstream industry and those things are in decline. You're going to escape into these other areas. It could be that those areas are no longer as easily to be escaped in or escaped in the future. So I think about that question regarding children. If you have children, is it and you think the world's going poorly, that's a problem. Is it virtuous to bring children into a world which is in decline? I don't know. I don't entirely know that questions. I mean, I think that's one of the schizophrenia that people on the right have. They recommend fertility and having kids and families, yet they also think, unlike the left, well, not the extreme left agrees with them, but unlike the center left, and the center right, who think everything is fine, everything's going great, like Nick Gillepsie, although Nick Gillepsie doesn't want to have lots of kids, or doesn't think that's necessarily a good thing. He thinks the world is better than it ever was. So that's like part of the problem, for me at least, here on a psychological level, regarding pessimism. I mean, I guess the Bob Murphy solution is the old solution, which is become quote unquote religious in a meaningful way. That's my final comment regarding the question of, are they too pessimistic and what to do about it. I do think it's a psychological problem. So within any comments on, having children, thanks for doing this episode. I mean, I basically agree that in certain sectors, it's obvious that things are in quote unquote decline. Whether there's corresponding industries that are better is a good question. Within any final comments or any comments on the children question or any other issues you want to bring up, please do.
As I say, I think on the psychological level, you need to distinguish between society in general and you individually. And for me, lockdown was clearly appalling and monstrous. However, I've done reasonably well out of it because everyone was forced to go online. And so now I get more business than I did before because I don't have to leave my house to get any. So that's really been a benefit to me, and for my family as a whole. So yes, lots of indicators are in decline. Yes, certainly. But individually, no, since 2020, things have been a bit better for me to a large extent. I mean, what you all say is correct with finding information and stuff. I mean, the internet was purged January 6th. That was ended up making internet a lot worse. But after Charlottesville stuff, the start of the big decline online of getting interesting stuff was the YouTube demonetization stuff, which incidentally, as I've already mentioned before, was the cause of some vegan Iranian woman to go and shoot up YouTube. Everyone forgets the female gunman, who happened to be Iranian. She failed. I mean, she injured someone. She died. So because it was argued, oh no, YouTube was sending people down the rabbit hole, otherwise known as people were interested in this material, so it suggested it, because that's what the algorithm's supposed to do. But as I say, I don't see any problem in bringing children into the world as decline. It may be the cause of its rebirth. So, and also, you can do things. You can do things in your own life to make your life better and make everything else better. And if the kids don't have as good a situation as you did, but it's still kind of good enough, then, well, I suppose you get the question, is it better for you never to have been born? Well, I mean, if you ask anybody at any point, I think they would generally say, I would prefer to have been born, in most cases. So yeah, I think this is what you need to. I think this is why the left, though, as an aside, ends up having basically, quote unquote, and this is dubious. We're both dubious of mental illness, but mental illness as such is because they don't have a strong sense of their own individual identity of them and their families. And so look at the world and then get really upset about the state of the world and then can't cope, even though their personal lives may be fine. Although actually they're probably very dysfunctional individuals anyway. But it's the fact that they can't circumscribe sort of spheres of action from individuals and others, and so that they end up sort of being crushed by society as a whole, and then sort of like messes their psychology up. Not that their psychology would be messed up for other reasons. And yes, of course, there are some leftists who are very clear-headed and aren't mental, as you know which ones I'm talking about. So yeah. So my final thing on decline is, I think the best thing to do in decline, first and foremost, is to specify what area you're in, and see to what extent is it in decline and what areas maybe actually improving. And then that can give you a clear-headed analysis. As an aside, with older people, I think a lot of older people dislike change because it's change, and they think things should be like they were when they grew up. And that's an innate human tendency, which is why I think when people get older, they can and oftentimes become grumpy and complain about things weren't as good as they used to be. And they may have good grounds thinking some things were good as they used to be. They just don't tend to be as clear-eyed as they ought to be on how it might have improved. And I think that would be my biggest beef, as it were, with the declinists, whilst me still probably being classified within the declines camp. I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.